American diver set a new record for the deepest dive in history. Victor Vescovo plunged nearly 36,000 feet in his watercraft.
Something is happening at the bottom of the Mariana Trench right now, and it involves you personally, whether you have ever thought about the ocean or not. It involves every person on this planet. Scientists found the proof 7 miles underwater, in a place no human had ever seen, in the bodies of creatures no one knew existed. And what that proof shows is deeply unsettling. The record that changed everything. On the 15th of August, 2022, a research team led by Professor Alan Jamieson from the University of Western Australia lowered a baited camera trap into the Izu Ogasawara Trench south of Japan.
One of the things we discovered a few years back was when we were working in the Mariana Trench, we found lots and lots of fiber optic cables.
What they filmed at 8,336 meters below the surface became the single most important footage in the history of deep ocean biology. A snailfish, pale as paper and almost completely transparent, was calmly swimming through one of the most hostile environments on this planet. It was not struggling. It was not dying. It was hunting. 5 days after that recording, in the adjacent Japan Trench, the team physically retrieved 2 specimens of the species Pseudoliparis belyaevi from traps set at 8,022 meters. These were the deepest fish ever physically caught in recorded history. Not observed, not filmed from a distance. Physically collected and brought back to the surface for scientific analysis. Professor Jamieson later described the equipment in a way that captures something important about how science works at extreme depth. He said they used standard fish traps from a local fishing shop, loaded with bait, then attached to a $200,000 deep-sea camera system. The fish living at the absolute edge of what biology allows were caught, at least partly, with gear you could pick up at any marine supply store. When scientists dissected the captured specimens, they found their stomachs packed full, not half full, packed. Hundreds of small crustaceans were crammed inside each animal, which means these creatures at nearly 6 miles beneath the surface are not merely surviving, they are thriving. They have found a way to dominate their environment so completely that they can afford to eat well at a depth that should not permit life to persist. The snailfish looks nothing like a monster. It looks like a pale, translucent tadpole with fins. It has a gelatinous body, no swim bladder, and a skeleton made mostly of soft cartilage. The juvenile filmed at the record depth may be using extreme pressure as a biological defense, retreating to depths that its predators physically cannot reach. Depth is not an obstacle for this animal. Depth is armor. Understanding exactly why requires going back to understand what the Mariana Trench actually is and why the extreme conditions down there produce extreme life rather than simply killing it. The deepest wound on Earth. The Mariana Trench sits in the western Pacific Ocean, roughly 200 miles southwest of Guam.
What is on Guam? Because Guam is the nearest island to Mariana. Guam is essentially the top bit of the ridge of the Mariana.
It stretches approximately 1,580 miles from north to south. But its length is not the point. Its depth is the point, and nothing in ordinary human experience prepares you for what that depth means. At its lowest point, a location called Challenger Deep, the trench reaches 36,037 feet below sea level. That is nearly 11 kilometers straight down. If you placed Mount Everest at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, its peak would still be buried more than 2 kilometers beneath the ocean's surface. Challenger Deep does not just run deep. It exists in a completely different category of reality from anything else on the surface of this planet. The trench exists because of a geological process called subduction. The Pacific Plate has been slowly diving beneath the smaller Mariana Plate for millions of years. Right at the point where that diving begins, the seafloor tears open like a seam giving way. The Pacific Plate being consumed here is approximately 170 million years old, dating back to the age of dinosaurs. Old oceanic crust is cold and dense, and cold, dense crust sinks deeper than younger, warmer crust. The Challenger Deep is the result of 170 million years of ocean floor cooling, growing heavy and plunging back into the mantle. The trench is a wound the Earth has been opening in itself since before the first flower ever bloomed on land. At the bottom of that wound, the water pressure exceeds 1,000 times the pressure at sea level, roughly 8 tons of force on every single square inch of surface area. The temperature stays just above freezing without meaningful variation, day after day, year after year. And the darkness is total in a way the word dark does not fully capture. Sunlight cannot penetrate beyond roughly 1,000 feet. Challenger Deep is more than 36 times deeper than that. No ray of sunlight has ever touched its floor. The concepts of day and night have never existed there. For most of human history, the scientific consensus was that deep trenches must be functionally lifeless. The pressure made biology seem impossible. The cold slowed every chemical reaction to a crawl. The absence of sunlight appeared to remove the foundation of every food chain. The 19th century oceanographer Sir Charles Wyville Thomson speculated in print that below a certain depth, the ocean might be entirely empty of life. That assumption survived in scientific thinking for over 100 years. Then, a series of expeditions descended into the darkness and proved Thomson spectacularly wrong. The first people to prove it were 2 men who descended in 1960 with equipment that had no right to survive the journey. 2 men in a glued sphere. On the 23rd of January 1960, United States Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh and Swiss engineer Jacques Piccard sealed themselves into a steel sphere barely 7 feet across and began the longest descent in human history. Their vessel was called the Bathyscaphe Trieste. It was a massive gasoline-filled buoyancy tank above a tiny, reinforced crew sphere, held together partly by a specially formulated epoxy that caused a visiting admiral to remark that the Navy does not glue its ships together. Walsh reportedly replied that perhaps not, but theirs was glued. Walsh was 27 years old when he climbed in. He had volunteered because no one else stepped forward. His deepest previous dive had been 300 feet. As the 2 men prepared to board, a crew member quietly attached a Rolex watch to the outer hull without informing the Navy, which had strict regulations against commercial use of its equipment. That watch survived the complete descent and worked perfectly on return, making it one of the most consequential product demonstrations in commercial history, conducted entirely in secret at the bottom of the world. The descent took nearly 5 hours. At approximately 30,000 feet, both men heard a sharp crack that vibrated through the entire vessel. An outer plexiglass window had fractured under the pressure. Their telephone connection to the surface had already failed at 18,000 feet. They were alone in absolute darkness, deeper than any human being had ever been, with no way to reach anyone. They looked at each other and made a decision without discussion. They continued downward. At 1:06 in the afternoon, the Trieste touched down at 35,800 feet. They had approximately 20 minutes before they needed to begin the long ascent. The temperature inside had dropped to just above 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, through the porthole, something moved. Piccard described seeing what appeared to be a flatfish, approximately 1 foot long, moving slowly across the floor of the deepest place on Earth. Then shrimp-like creatures drifted past the glass. After more than a century of assuming the deep trenches were empty graves, the floor of the Mariana Trench already had company. When they surfaced and reported the flatfish, the scientific community was skeptical. Without photographs or physical specimens, an eyewitness account was not conclusive. Some researchers later suggested it may have been a sea cucumber rather than a true fish. The question was never resolved. Don Walsh spent the rest of his life watching the mystery he helped create get answered by every generation of explorers who followed him. He died in November of 2023 at the age of 92. Nobody returned to the bottom of the Mariana Trench for 52 years after that first descent. When humans finally went back in 2012, they brought cameras. What those cameras captured raised questions that took another decade to begin answering, and what the answers revealed about contamination was worse than almost anyone had expected. The civilization in the dark. In 2021, a Chinese research submersible named Fenduji.
China's submersible is carrying out its latest mission at the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean,
which translates to Striver, descended into the Mariana Trench 33 times across a 3-month expedition. What those researchers brought back changed the entire conversation about what life is capable of at the bottom of the ocean. The team collected over 1,600 sediment samples. When scientists analyzed them, they identified more than 7,000 microbial species. Of those 7,000 species, 89% were completely unknown to science. Not rare, not endangered, unknown. They had never been seen, named, or described by any researcher in the entire history of biology. A single 3-month expedition produced nearly 6,300 species of microscopic life that no human being had ever encountered before. But the microbes were not the main event. At 31,270 feet below the surface, the Fenduja team turned on their lights and found something that stopped the scientists on board completely. There were tube worms swaying in the deep current, some reaching up to 12 inches long, growing in dense colonies across the bottom. There were fields of clams packed so tightly they looked like cobblestones stretching as far as the cameras could see. The researchers described what they were observing as a river of life running along the floor of the trench. This was a chemosynthetic ecosystem, which means it ran entirely on chemical energy rather than sunlight. Methane and hydrogen sulfide seeping through cracks in the seafloor were feeding microbial mats spreading across the sediment like pale snow. Everything else fed from those mats. There had never been sunlight at that depth, but life had assembled an entire working civilization from the chemistry of the Earth itself, completely independent of the sun that drives almost every other ecosystem on this planet. Dr. Weishu Zhao, an extremophile microbiologist from Shanghai Jiao Tong University who personally descended in the Fenduja, watched bioluminescent organisms glowing in greens, yellows, and oranges against the surrounding blackness. When the lights came on at the seafloor, she later said that, at that moment, she knew immediately that the deep ocean must be a much more thriving habitat than anyone had imagined. And then, sitting right alongside the tube worm forests and the clam fields that took millions of years to grow, the researchers found something that had absolutely no business being there. Plastic bags, beer bottles, soda cans, and in the nearby Yap Trench, sitting on the sea floor in the permanent darkness, there was a nearly intact laundry basket. The plastic had arrived before the scientists did. The discovery was quietly devastating. These were places no human eye had ever seen. Ecosystems evolving in total isolation for geological ages, and yet humanity's throwaway culture had already left its mark. The trash hadn't drifted there by accident. It had been carried by the same ocean currents that sustain life, delivered to the deepest address on Earth like an unwanted postcard from the surface world. How a plastic bag ends up 7 miles underwater, next to a tube worm forest that took millions of years to grow, requires understanding what we have been doing to the ocean for the past century. And the answer is considerably more disturbing than most people realize. Named after our garbage. In 2019, explorer Victor Vescovo piloted a submersible called the Limiting Factor to 35,853 feet below sea level, the deepest crewed dive ever recorded at that time. He returned to the Challenger Deep multiple times, becoming the first person in history to visit the bottom of the Mariana Trench more than once. On one dive, he switched off his thrusters, floated silently above the sea floor, and ate a sandwich 7 miles beneath the surface. He later said it was the most peaceful moment of his life. Then he saw the plastic bag, lying on the floor of the Challenger Deep at nearly 7 miles below the surface. In a location more remote than the summit of Everest, there was a plastic bag alongside candy wrappers. Vescovo described the discovery as deeply disappointing and said the ocean is not a garbage collection pool, even though human civilization has been treating it as one for generations. His team sent every biological specimen they collected to laboratories for tissue analysis. Nearly every animal contained microplastics inside its body tissue, not on the outside surface, inside. In a study examining 90 amphipods from 6 different Pacific Ocean trenches, researchers found that in the Mariana Trench, the contamination rate was 100%. Every single amphipod from the deepest trench on Earth had microplastics inside its hindgut. Every one. The mechanism is straightforward and deeply uncomfortable. Plastic breaks down into microscopic particles under sunlight and physical action over time. Those particles attach to organic matter, drifting down through the water column as part of the natural food supply for the deepest animals on Earth. The same system that delivers nutrition to animals at 36,000 feet delivers our pollution with exactly the same efficiency. Every meal that sinks from the surface carries our waste along with it. In 2020, researchers discovered a brand new amphipod species in the Mariana Trench. They analyzed the first specimen ever collected. It contained microplastics. They named the species Eurythenes plasticus because it had been contaminated before any scientist in human history even knew it was alive. A creature named after the poison it was born into before anyone had bothered to discover it existed. Separate research found extraordinary concentrations of persistent organic pollutants in Mariana Trench amphipod tissue. These were industrial chemicals produced primarily between the 1930s and 1970s, including polychlorinated biphenyls from electronics manufacturing. The contamination levels matched those found in Suruga Bay in Japan, one of the most industrially polluted coastal water bodies in Asia. Marine biologist Alan Jameson described it plainly. We are piling all our crap into the place we know least about. Once those compounds arrive in the Hadal zone, there is no mechanism that brings them back to the surface. Scientists estimate it took roughly 40 years for those compounds to travel from industrial facilities on land, through rivers and coastal waters, through the ocean surface, down through the entire water column, and finally into the tissue of animals at the bottom of the most remote place on Earth. 40 years of slow contamination of a place no one was watching. The animals carrying that pollution inside their bodies are themselves among the most extraordinary biological achievements in the entire history of life on this planet.
Of the world is still completely unexplored, and yet there's all these concerns about climate change and how does the world work?
Surviving in the Mariana Trench does not just require toughness. It requires a body operating on completely different rules from anything biology developed near the surface. Bodies that break the rules. At over 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, the danger to a living body is not what most people picture. Water is nearly incompressible, and so are the fluids inside a living cell. Pressure applied equally from all directions does not crush tissue the way a mechanical press crushes metal. The real danger is chemical. Proteins can only do their job when folded into very specific three-dimensional shapes, held together by weak molecular interactions. When extreme pressure forces everything to pack more tightly, those interactions break down. Proteins misfold. Enzymes stop working. For a surface organism dropped into the Hadal zone, this is not a dramatic crushing. It is a complete and silent biochemical collapse. Deep-sea species survive this through a compound called trimethylamine N-oxide, which scientists abbreviate as TMAO. It acts as a molecular scaffold inside cells, holding protein shapes stable under conditions that would destroy the same proteins in a surface organism. The concentration of TMAO in deep-sea fish tissue increases in direct proportion to depth, functioning as a biological pressure gauge built into the chemistry of the animal. It is also the compound primarily responsible for the strong smell most people associate with fish. Deep-sea fish, if you could somehow bring one to a kitchen, would smell absolutely extraordinary. But TMAO creates its own ceiling. At approximately 8,200 to 8,400 meters down, the concentration required to counteract the pressure begins to disrupt cellular function in a completely different way, interfering with the osmotic balance that keeps cells alive. No fish can accumulate enough TMAO to survive below that point without simultaneously destroying itself through a different mechanism. This is the actual reason fish have a maximum depth limit, not structural failure, not crushed bones. A molecular trade-off that runs out of options at a specific number. Deep-sea fish also have bones far less mineralized than their shallow water relatives, softer, lighter, and more flexible, approaching in extreme cases the consistency of cartilage. This seems completely backwards. More pressure should demand stronger structure. Instead, evolution consistently selects for softer and cheaper biological architecture because a heavily mineralized skeleton requires constant maintenance. And all of that costs calories a deep-sea animal simply cannot afford, in an environment where a meal might not arrive for weeks or months. Many deep-sea fish have eliminated the swim bladder entirely, and instead achieve neutral buoyancy by storing specific fats and increasing the water content of their tissue until their overall density closely matches the surrounding seawater. In some species, this produces flesh so gelatinous it would be completely unrecognizable as fish to anyone from the surface world. That softness and near transparency are not deformities. They are the physical signature of a body precisely engineered to float effortlessly in the deepest water on Earth. Then there are the mouths. Deep-sea predators frequently have mouths capable of opening to extreme angles, engineered to swallow prey approaching their own body mass. The skull has been restructured with bones connected less rigidly, so the entire head functions as a hinged capture mechanism. The teeth angle inward toward the throat, meaning any prey that tries to escape drives itself deeper rather than out. These are the teeth of an animal that cannot afford to lose what it has caught, because in the deep ocean, a missed meal might mean waiting months in total darkness, with no guarantee that anything edible will come close again. Every adaptation in the deep ocean follows one underlying rule: build cheap, waste nothing, and make one decisive strike when the opportunity arrives. But all of that biological ingenuity runs into a hard biochemical wall at a specific depth, and the creature living closest to that wall leads us to one of the strangest discoveries in the entire story. The animal that invented something new. Below the depth where fish chemistry runs out of options, the ecology of the Hadal Zone reorganizes entirely around organisms that do not carry the metabolic overhead of vertebrate biology. Amphipods dominate the deepest zones. These shrimp-like crustaceans can tolerate pressures that push fish past their biochemical limits and operate at energy costs no vertebrate can match. They swarm in footage from the bottom of the Mariana Trench in numbers that make the deepest place on Earth look genuinely busy. Scientists studying the supergiant amphipods of the Mariana Trench
From 7,000 meters, we found this, which is called the supergiant amphipod.
which can grow up to 7 inches long, made a discovery that has no parallel anywhere else in the natural world. The species Hirundellea gigas strengthens its exoskeleton using aluminum extracted directly from the silica-rich sediments of the trench floor. It processes the sediment, isolates the aluminum, and incorporates it into its own structural biology. This makes it the first known species in the entire history of life on Earth to use aluminum as a biological building material. The deepest animals on Earth invented a biochemical technology that nothing else in 3.5 billion years of life has independently developed. An animal living in permanent darkness at the bottom of the deepest trench on Earth figured out how to do something the entire rest of the biosphere has never managed. The fact that we only discovered this in the past 2 decades is a useful reminder of how little we actually know about what is living on this planet. Those same aluminum-armored amphipods were also, when tested, carrying microplastics and industrial chemicals in their tissue at levels matching the most heavily polluted coastal environments on Earth. The animal representing the deepest expression of evolutionary ingenuity ever documented on this planet is simultaneously one of the most chemically contaminated organisms scientists have ever analyzed. That intersection, extraordinary biological innovation alongside irreversible industrial contamination in the same body, at the same depth, is what makes the Mariana Trench story genuinely impossible to look away from. The chemosynthetic ecosystems found by the Fenduji expedition in 2021 also raised a question about something far larger than ocean biology. The dominant scientific hypothesis of the 20th century was that life on Earth first originated in shallow, warm, sunlit water, where solar energy drove chemistry toward the first self-replicating molecules. The discovery of a thriving chemosynthetic ecosystem at over 31,000 feet, running entirely on chemical energy from the Earth's interior in permanent darkness, challenges that hypothesis fundamentally. Life may not have required sunlight to get started. If that is true, the implications extend well beyond this planet. Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, has a liquid ocean beneath its ice shell, kept warm by tidal heating. Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, has hydrothermal vents, generating the same chemistry that drives the deep-sea ecosystems of the Mariana Trench. Both moons became dramatically more interesting as candidates for extraterrestrial life after the Fenduji findings were published. Life operating on chemistry, rather than sunlight in permanent darkness, is not a theoretical possibility. It is a documented reality existing right now at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. What the bottom actually tells us. The Mariana Trench has been directly visited by fewer humans than have walked on the surface of the moon. Approximately 22 people have descended to the Challenger Deep. 12 people have stood on the lunar surface. The most remote location on Earth is, by actual human visit count, less explored than another world 239,000 miles away. 80% of the global Hadal zone has never been visited at all. And yet, the contamination arrived before the science did. By the time the first proper scientific cameras reached the floor of the Mariana Trench in 2012, industrial chemicals were already sitting in the bodies of the animals living there. By the time any biologist ever laid eyes on Eurythenes plasticus, discovered in 2020, it already had microplastics in its tissue. A species was poisoned before it was discovered. We contaminated an animal before we knew it was alive. That is not a metaphor. That is what the tissue analysis showed. There is, however, something on the other side of that story that deserves equal attention. Deep-sea microbes in the Hadal zone appear to have developed over millions of years in the dark, a capacity to break down some of the pollutants now reaching the trench floor. Dr. Zhao noted in the Fenduji findings that the biochemistry of Hadal zone microorganisms might offer new approaches to dealing with environmental pollution at the surface.
Without a healthy ocean, people are not healthy, and so our very lives dip the ocean for survival.
The organisms that human civilization unknowingly contaminated before anyone knew they existed may have spent millions of years evolving a partial biochemical solution to the problem we created. The animals we poisoned before we discovered them might eventually help us clean up after ourselves. The Mariana Trench is also changing our understanding of what counts as a discovery worth protecting. Most conservation conversations happen around things we can see: forests, coral reefs, charismatic megafauna that make good photographs. The tube worm forests and clam fields at 31,000 feet represent millions of years of biological development in an environment so stable and isolated that evolution proceeded in directions impossible anywhere else. We found them, documented them, and in the same expedition found the garbage lying next to them. The bottom of the ocean is not the edge of the world. It is not an empty grave. It is not irrelevant to human activity. It is the place where everything that falls eventually arrives, which makes it the most accurate long-term record of everything human civilization has released into the natural world. The polychlorinated biphenyls in amphipod tissue at 36,000 feet are a precise chemical record of industrial decisions made in the 1950s and 1960s. The plastic in the body of Eurythenes plasticus is a precise record of how we handle our waste. The laundry basket on the floor of the Yap Trench is a precise record of what we throw into the sea. Right now, in the permanent dark, under 8 tons of pressure on every square inch, in water that has not changed temperature in 10,000 years, a pale, translucent snailfish is hunting at a depth that breaks the known biochemical rules of vertebrate life. Nearby, amphipods in aluminum armor are processing sediment in a way nothing else in the history of biology has ever attempted. A tube worm forest is swaying in the deep current, fed by chemistry rising from the Earth's interior through cracks in a sea floor sinking for 170 million years. Bioluminescent organisms are producing the only light that has ever existed in that part of the world. And inside the bodies of virtually every animal tested, embedded in tissue samples being analyzed in laboratories around the world, is the measurable, chemical, unavoidable residue of human civilization. We found a world we did not know existed. We had already contaminated it before we found it. What we do with both of those facts is the actual question the Mariana Trench leaves us with. A species was named after our plastic before scientists even knew it existed, and 80% of the Hadal zone has never been explored at all. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because nobody actually knows what is living in the rest of it.